Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the In Conversation podcast. This week we'll be discussing film locations and the latest installment of our World Film Locations book series, which is a new volume focusing on Los Angeles. My guests today are series editor Gabriel Solomons and his co-editors on this volume, Cowan and Fabrice Ziolkowski. Welcome to you all, and thanks very much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you. Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Great. Well, look, to begin with, I'd like you all just to briefly maybe just tell us a little bit about yourselves. Just introduce yourselves. Fabrice, I'm going to start with you. So who are you and what's your kind of involvement in film?
Well, I'm a screenwriter, mostly in the last few years in animation. And I wrote a feature called Secret of Cows, which had some fair amount of success. But otherwise, I also have directed a lot of documentaries, and that's mostly my involvement in film over the last, I'd say, 40 years.
Well, I think you're being very modest, Fabrice. So I'll let people Google you so they can find out a bit more about your successful background in film. But I appreciate that. Thank you. And Jared, what about yourself? Tell us a bit about yourself and what your involvement in cinema is.
Yeah, well, I've just always loved film since I was a kid. Went the whole film school route, and worked as a camera person for a little while when moving out to LA about 20 years ago, and then got a little more into journalism and into my just love of film locations that I've always had since I was a kid. So sort of started to take my knowledge of film production and then just put it with the passion that I've always just held in my heart all my life, and especially regarding filming locations.
Awesome. So this must be a passion project for you. I'm looking forward to getting a bit more info about that. And Gabriel, of course, I've known you for a while, my friend. We've worked together at Intellect Books back in the day, and we've worked on a few book series, including this one. But other than your involvement in the World Film Locations, what's your kind of background and your involvement in film?
Unlike my other two esteemed co-editors, I have none of that relationship to film. My relationship to film is purely as a fan, someone that loved it, someone that was introduced to it very young by my mum. So I've got her to thank for my love of film. But I've just always loved it. I've loved it as a storytelling device. I think it's just a hobby that I've always found a passion in. And I guess as a graphic designer, I've always wanted to do books and magazines about film just because it was, so much of a passion. So it was like, I think my way into film, moving away from just a fan and then thinking about its relationship to me as a designer, was just doing, finding projects, finding publications, finding opportunities. The second magazine I ever did was about film, and, working with Masood, who set up Intellect. We kind of shared a little bit of that passion, and he was one of the first people that really encouraged me to do a publication around film, which ultimately led to World Film Locations.
Well, let me just kind of stop you right there and ask you another question. Then, obviously, World Film Locations Los Angeles 2 is a new edition. You've already done World Film Locations Los Angeles, which was one of the initial 4 books that was published, I think, from memory, back in 2012. Series since then has developed and come on leaps and bounds, and I know there's more than 40 titles in the series now. So could you just tell us a little bit, briefly about the kind of the origin story of the World Film Locations series, kind of the genesis, how it came apart, and then what kind of, just give us the books in a nutshell, really.
Well, I guess the inspiration for it was a film that I saw in 2003, which was Tom Anderson's Los Angeles Plays Itself. And because I'd lived in LA when I was younger, when I was a kid, at a sort of time where all of those, films were kind of like a major part of my upbringing, because I was there in 83 and 84 and 85, when you had just so many movies that were coming out and featured LA. I think that was already there, and it was kind of like a really big part of who I was. But when I watched the film, and at that stage, 2003, I think my understanding of LA in movies had changed, because I'd watched a lot more films. and I'd moved away from LA and I'd lived in Europe a lot more. So I think his film sort of opened me up to this appreciation of the city in a way that I hadn't really thought about before. So that was kind of like, that kick-started an interest. And then at the same sort of time, because I was at Intellect at the time and I was working there, you know, Masood and I spoke about the idea of doing a film mag, which I had come up with a concept for. And one of the sections was called On Location. So every issue, and we had 20, I think it was 23 or 24 issues all told, you know, when we did it over, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. Every issue would feature like 4 pages of a particular city. And there would be maybe 3 or 4 movies that we would feature. And it was talking about, you know, locations. And, I think that alongside things like I was reading books, there was one called Scenes from the City or Scene from the City, which is about photographing New York. And that was a James Saunders book. And there was another book about LA called Landscapes of Desire. And it's like all of these things sort of came together to make me think, do you know what, you know, location and this kind of appreciation that people have for, you know, movie locations, wanting to visit places that are kind of like part of that magic and get them a little bit closer to, to things that they just love. And so it was kind of like cine tourism. You know, there was a big thing going on at the time, I think after Lord of the Rings, where New Zealand was featured heavily. And so there was a lot of talk and discussion and chat. It wasn't the first time that locations had sort of been featured a lot, but I saw a lot more online. I saw, a couple of books that came out about it. And I think, kickstarting off the magazine, we were like, you know what? We did these 4 pages per mag. And Masood and I just said, you know what? This would make a great series. Because at the time, Intellect was doing a lot more book series. So I was like, well, I'm jumping on that straight away. So then it was like making a list of all the cities and then looking at the ones that we originally, kind of came up with and saying, right, if we can make a list of 40 or 50 movies, how can we turn this into something that would be interesting to people, but not just be a picture book, but would be kind of insightful, interesting, bring in, people that were kind of experts, I guess, and knew the city particularly well, but were interested in film, and then did a little bit of what Intellect was looking for, which was like a little bit more of a deep dive, not a surface level type thing, but a little bit more accessible, less esoteric and more accessible, but still in line with what Intellect tries to do, which is to add a little bit of depth to, people's understanding and knowledge.
Thanks, Gabriel. That's nice. You've hit that in a nutshell there, I think. And these are they're kind of pocketbooks almost, aren't they? As well, they're quite small, they're compact.
Yeah.
I know the BFI, for example, stocked them for many years and still has them in the film store. So they work very well for bookshops and retailers. So they're certainly not too esoteric. They definitely are accessible, but neither are they encyclopedic, right? Because each of these volumes is more of a pocket guide. You've got a selection of scenes, a selection of locations, and then a number of accompanying essays, spotlight essays or articles, with prominent film individuals, people within the industry, or scholars, or sort of, I guess there's quite a few journalists have been involved, critics and figures like that too. So it's kind of not exactly a trade series. It definitely has a lot of depth, but it's certainly meant for just a film enthusiast, or I suppose like a touristic film enthusiast, someone visiting a city like Los Angeles could grab this book, take it with them in their bag, and then they could, they could navigate the city utilizing this book as a, inspiration or explanation, depending on their kind of their mood. But maybe I can just bring Jared in here. Like, if the books aren't encyclopedic, how did you guys go about deciding what films make the cut? Was there any process there?
Yeah, I think there was a long process. I mean, it was funny. I sort of came in. I think Gabriel and Fabrice had already sort of started on the process. If I remember, this was like a little while ago already. So I'm so excited the book's coming out because it was a while ago. But I remember, they already had sort of a spreadsheet of some things they had spoken about, and then I came in, and I remember at least my perspective was, I wanted to throw some films and locations on there that I had already written about in my professional career, because I was actually interested to hear what somebody else would write about it. I actually didn't take those on. I put them on there specifically, a handful of them, and said, okay, I think these would be great for this reason or that reason, but I want somebody else to write about it, whether it's one of my co-editors or one of our contributors that we brought on. So that was sort of at least my standpoint coming into it. Some of them are perhaps a little more iconic than others, and I like that. I like that there are the iconic ones, but then there's sort of maybe the little secrets that are tucked in somewhere. And I think we developed a list, pretty well together with those things in mind. At least that's how I approached it.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's something that's quite important to mention as well, is that there's a lot of iconic movies, the likes of Tron and many other classics, but there are these hidden gems, and I even consider myself a bit of a cinephile, and leafing through there's still a few movies I'm like, gotta have to go back and check that one. I don't think I've seen that. So it definitely is illuminating as well, and I like the way that you as editors have kind of have collated that. You did mention some of the spotlight essays and the contributors. Fabrice, I've got some questions for you in a second, but I was just going to check in with Gabriel on this one as well, because I know that the spotlight articles were always something that you were particularly interested in. How did you go about kind of deciding? Well, perhaps you could just pinpoint some of the spotlight essays and articles that are included in this volume, and how did you go about recruiting different people to come and speak about these particular topics?
Well, I think we were all involved in that process.
Okay.
I think the essays, I think what's nice about the essays is it gives a little bit more kind of room to maneuver, and kind of explore. It might be a particular region, or it might be, a thematic strand, or it might be a specific point in time, because we've got a nice one about sort of avant-garde LA, which I think Fabrice, through his connections and his contact, was able to find someone to do that. I mean, did you want to mention a little bit about that one, Fabrice, about why that one was interesting, or why we felt that was a good inclusion?
Yeah, I thought that, I knew David James, who had kindly written about a film that Gabriel included in the book, which is a film that I made in 1980. Called LAX, which was sort of like experimental documentary, you might call it, and which also went into some of the things that LA Plays Itself went into as well. And I think that Tom Anderson was kind about that film. And the reason how I got involved with Gabriel is because in the volume one, my LAX was mentioned in there, so I contacted him. And since then, we've been working on different things, including him doing some design of a book of photography that I've done. But the avant-garde to me is something that because I've had those connections since for a long time with avant-garde cinema in Europe and in the States. Most of the time, the avant-garde cinema in the United States is focused in New York, which is a bigger hub. But there has been this presence in LA of people working on the edges, people who are working next to this gigantic industry, and suddenly they're doing things a little differently on the side, and seeing how they can survive doing that as in all avant-garde films, which are mostly, on the edges. To a certain extent. So I thought that was just something that needed to be given a nod to, which, and then David did a really nice job on that.
Well, I wanted to ask you actually a little bit about European filmmakers, and as a filmmaker yourself, Fabrice, what do you think makes LA so alluring, not only for American filmmakers, but also for Europeans?
Well, I think for European filmmakers, the ones that you can think about who have come to do it now. I mean, it starts way back when, because Fritz Lang is a whole group of filmmakers who come before World War II and so on and so forth. A lot of emigres who come to, but they don't usually talk about LA as such too much. But LA's attraction, I think, really comes in European cinema from European filmmakers. In, let's say, in the 50s and 60s, when the French New Wave comes out and things of that sort. And LA, like, well, this is the attraction of it's the American dream in general, but then it's focused down into LA as this sort of nexus of all that's modern and so on. And it is the film industry, so that European filmmakers who come to LA want to see, but they don't come to LA to make Hollywood films, or if they do, a lot of times they leave pretty soon afterwards. But they come to make a sort of another angle on the reality of LA, which you're not going to find in other ways. And sometimes, in the best, from my point of view, they find a way to not be they find a way to meld their European viewpoint, which then they bring back to Europe and saying, "This is what I found in LA." But in the case of someone like Polanski, his European filmmaker comes to LA, makes a film that's iconic about LA, but for international audiences. It's not a quirky, just a European point of view. Yet it's hard for me to think of somebody else who would have made that film that particular way, especially when you know a bit about Chinatown and how Robert Towne worked with him and so on and so forth, and Polanski's point of view, which is it's fairly much more European. So I think there's this exoticism to a certain extent, and then that's why I mentioned in the book Agnes Varda's film documentary Murmure, about all the walls, the murals in LA and things like that. Otherwise, Jacques Demy and Antonioni and these people who come to Wim Wenders in particular also. So for them, I think it's this. It's a way of trying to dig a little deeper into the myth.
Yeah. I guess
especially they don't come to LA; they come to Hollywood to a certain extent. Really put their nose into that.
Yeah, I guess it's the big league, the other for some of these Europeans as well. They want to come and leave their indelible mark on that. Well, it's, the other side is your American filmmakers who want to go make a film in Paris or Rome, and there's a similar sort of. There's certainly been a lot of interesting transatlantic connections over the years, that's for sure. In addition to like that spotlight sort of article that Fabrice has talked about, and the European angle on LA. Jared or Gabriel, would you just tell me a little bit more about some of the other spotlight features and articles that you included in the volume?
Well, did you want to mention, Jared? Because I was.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, the one that I think I was happy to include was one about film in the San Fernando Valley, which I have my friend write about. He's a producer. He lives here in the Valley, and he's also from the UK originally. So we're talking again about Europeans in Los Angeles and their viewpoint on it. And I think Andrew, he did a really great job expressing this love of coming from the UK and seeing all these things on television while living in or in the cinema or in television while living in maybe maybe somewhat more of a gloomy atmosphere, and then coming here to the Valley and this bright and sunny place where the Karate Kid lived around the corner from where he lives right now. So I was very happy to, and I live in the San Fernando Valley too. So, and it's a great place with a long history. Of course, some of the studios are here in the Valley, so a lot of that location filming, aside from the fact that there were just great locations here, was really just out of necessity, right? They're just going from Universal or Warner Brothers to somewhere close by to shoot, and then that ends up becoming iconic. So I'm happy to have that essay in the book.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I was just going to mention, James, about I mean, two of them that I really, I think they're great additions to the volume, because I think just the way of having slightly, like each essay brings in a different angle. So, and it's very typical to the city itself. So, Thomas Per's essay, which he writes about the fact of, like, you need to have a car to live in LA, and what happens when you don't have a car. So the idea of covering films that have very particularly featured the idea of the absence of a car, and then what happens, how do you navigate the city? How do you navigate the city when you're on foot? How do you then see the city? If it is meant to be one of those kind of synonymous places with, motorways or highways, and people sitting in cars, because there are so many movies that feature, that sense of it, either people being in traffic. And I think, that one, and then we're talking about like Europeans, Alberto Zambenedetti, who's been involved in this series before, and he did a book on Florence. He did a volume on Florence. So he wrote about Disneyland. So the sense again of a location, which is like a simulacrum. Is that the way that you say the word? This kind of like fictional, fabricated idea of what America is, that is located in Los Angeles. Yeah. But, it hasn't really been featured very often. It has been featured. And this is where it's quite interesting, because I love the discourse and the dialogue that happens when we're doing these books, because Jared, with his understanding and his knowledge of, filming locations, Alberto had written the essay in a particular way with a few little oversights. Not that I don't think it's a lack of his knowledge, but it's the idea that everyone is able to participate, bounce off the content. So we can kind of, we're sort of proofing for ourselves, but we're also learning more about it. None of us basically feeling like we're right where it stops with all the knowledge. We all have our own particular takes on it, but the combination of having, this is what I love about this volume, is that there's three of us. And I think, both Fabrice and Jared's knowledge has just made it so much better, but also the writers, especially when they're writing, these spotlight essays, there's the opportunity to kind of like send that through and say, oh, but did you think about this? Because everyone is sharing that content and it doesn't just stay in isolation. And I think the book has become so much better for that. For that interplay, the dialogue that's happened. So it feels like a moving kind of, gestating sort of project. I know sometimes, the length that it takes to make these things can feel like, oh my word, there's probably been another 100 movies in LA by the time, from since we started the book or the project to now. But that's the beauty, because I think LA just kind of has this abundance of riches that is constantly bringing out more movies. And I think that's the great thing, is between the first volume and this one, there's been 12 years. So we've been able to include a lot more films that have been made during that time, not necessarily all iconic, but we can choose some of those that add to the mix of what we had in the first one. And that's why I feel the two of them really work as companions, because there's a lot of the iconic ones in the first one, but it really kind of challenged us a little bit more in the second volume to find these really interesting ones, maybe less iconic, but maybe have become more iconic since the first volume came out. And that was, that was a really nice part of the book.
I think that's an interesting proposition. And it's also interesting, of course, that Fabrice mentioned Polanski and Chinatown. And then, of course, now I believe in this volume, you'll have included Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and you have that kind of meta, Tarantino take on that period in Hollywood history. So I think that there's something quite interesting there as well, linking in with what you've just said about the 12 years and certain films referencing other films that are the second volume referencing movies referencing films that were in the first volume. That's kind of cool. Talking about films, though, I did want to ask you a little bit directly, the three of you, about LA. A couple of questions. I'll start with you, Fabrice. To you, what's one of your favorite or most iconic films that was shot in LA and really captures and encapsulates Los Angeles?
Well, I guess I've already talked about Chinatown, and I think it's hard to do better than that. Somebody said, I just saw somewhere that said because Robert Towne just passed away, and so they say, oh, it was the best screenplay in the last 50 years, and I say, well, you have to go back to the other way too. So maybe it's the last 100 years, because there have been very few films about LA or with that kind of script. That's but that's basically because also I'm always, the relationship we all have with LA is different. Jared now lives here. He came 20 years ago. He came from the outside. I was living in Florida when I was 18, and I had this, I'm going to go there. Came to Los Angeles. Went to school there and so on, and stayed and lived basically about 15 years there. So I had my own relationship to LA in terms of how you discover it. So you discover it through the movies, and then this concept of, because I'm European, the concept of history of where am I living? What's going on here? What's behind the facade? What is behind these streets? How did this happen? So LA history became a really big thing for me, and Polanski really touched on that in terms of not only visually, of the city and so on, but in terms of the corruption behind it and all these things. Which later on, it gets picked up in LA Confidential, which is also another great film. But aside from that, I have a second choice, which would be Zabriskie Point.
Okay.
Antonioni, especially. I think there's some shots of downtown LA with some buildings that are gone now. It's like very, very moving. In terms of films about LA, I mean, films that really do, touch on that. I think it's hard to do better.
Two iconic choices. I hope Jared Fabrice has left you with some others. What for you is a film that's sort of iconic that was filmed in LA?
This is very hard, James. This is very hard. This is very hard.
We keep you on your toes here.
I find that some of my favorites are actually specific to certain areas of LA, certain pockets of LA, rather than sort of the pastiche of the whole thing. Like if I really have to pick one, I may have to say Boogie Nights. Okay. I think I saw it in the theater countless times. I don't even remember how many times. And again, I live here in the San Fernando Valley, and there's just an energy to that movie that he captured that I think is unlike anything else. And I'm very much into these Valley movies, and whether maybe it's even The Karate Kid. That's another, maybe right there. And it's more than just, of course, it's a very 80s film. There's a great line in it where Ralph Macchio said, hey, it's the 80s, you know what I mean? But there's a lot going on in it, right? I mean, he shows up, he comes from New Jersey. He doesn't want to come to LA. His mom's forcing him to come here. And what happens? The first thing when he pulls up in front of this apartment building that he's not terribly excited about going into is there's a pool, but there's no water in the pool. Okay? Like, he's coming to California. The least he could have is a pool, right? That's one of the things, palm trees and a pool. Okay? He doesn't even have that. So there's actually a lot going on in that movie. It's not just the crane kick and all that stuff. So anyway, it's very hard to kind of pick, but I'd say maybe those, and again, another movie that's kind of focused in a certain area is maybe Jackie Brown. Is a favorite of mine as well. So I'll leave it there, because otherwise I'll just keep going.
No, well, you get, I mean, great selections, but we better give Gabriel something.
Yeah.
Gabriel, how about yourself, my friend? Anything that has been missed off the list?
The thing is, I'm a bit of a sucker for Michael Mann, right? And I have been for a long time.
Yeah.
But rather than kind of choosing a film that is one of my favorites, which is contentious in one way because I think some people love it, other people absolutely hate it, which is Heat. I actually felt that, and it's kind of a strange thing because I have a nostalgia for LA, and some of it I think I try to recreate every time I go back, and I can never quite connect with the LA that I remember as a kid, right? Because so much time has come and my experiences have changed and I don't live there anymore. I don't have the same sort of connections. You know, I do have a little bit through history, but the film that I kind of sort of made me really nostalgic was Collateral, because I think there's two things about the film that I love. Well, probably more than that, but, and I'm not necessarily saying it's my favorite film of his or my favorite film generally, but there's an atmosphere and a mood, because Jared was talking about atmosphere about it. And a lot of the things that I love about LA was nighttime LA. There's something, the way that it was filmed, you know, with slightly different cameras, you know, it wasn't the, you know, the big full setup. It was, you know, more like DV cameras. And there's a sense of reality and authenticity to the way that it's filmed, which in Heat you don't really get. It's beautiful. And Heat does a lot of great scenes, nighttime scenes, especially like the bank heist, but or the jewelry store heist. But Collateral, the going through the city at night, because it was one of those things that I didn't really experience because I left LA before I was 17 or 16. So I never drove. I only drove a little bit around LA. So I think my nostalgia for it is that watching that movie and the places that it goes through and the car travels through and the little locations and the seeing LA from, you know, above and like alleyways and all these different things is almost like an LA that I never experienced as a driver, you know, as a teenager that would drive around that city and be like, hey man, this is really cool. And going into the city and going to downtown, I never did it. So I think there's kind of like a personal weird sort of nostalgia I have to it, that film, every time I watch it, I kind of get lost in it. Like, this is me driving in this car. So that to me, I mean, there's so many great movies of LA and you know, so many scenes, but I think as a complete whole, it's a film that just resonates with me, you know, brilliantly. And the second film actually that came out of this volume, because I watched it because Fabrice was writing about it and I'd written about it a little bit before, was Agnes Varda's Murmurs, because it introduced me to places of LA that I had no clue about. And I love murals because that appealed to me from a graphic designer standpoint. And it just, you know, like the mural wall and the thing that we feature in the book, those two as companion pieces, and also the idea that it's a European seeing the city. And the way that a European sees the city is very different to someone that lives there. And I wasn't born in LA. So I guess there's like a relationship that I have to those eyes wide open to like, this is amazing, but it's also kind of strange and odd and surreal. And it's not really European.
So every time that I go back to LA, I rent a car and I drive around all night.
Yeah.
With the music really loud.
Let's do that together next time.
Yeah, that's
a very special experience.
Yeah,
which, it's particular to. I don't think you do the same thing in Detroit, but I think, you know, LA's got that thing, and Collateral really did nab that.
Yeah. I think we've found a way to do a launch event for this book. Maybe we just drive around Los Angeles, pretending we're you know, in a Michael Mann movie and
throwing books out the window.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. It's better than bullets, I guess.
It's funny. Now we're all talking about Collateral, but
no, go for it.
A couple of our contributors on the book are the husband and wife team of David Wasco and Sandy Reynolds Wasco. He was the production designer. She was the set decorator on Collateral. They're both LA aficionados. They won the Oscars for design for La La Land, and they took on a location from the movie Beginners in this new volume. So I'm very excited that they wrote something. They love Los Angeles like no other, and especially when it comes to, I think, production designers that I've met. They have a passion for it like nobody else. So,
well, Jared, thank you for highlighting that, because I think that's really important. There's so many tremendous, you know, film aficionados and people from the industry, as I said, journalists, critics, people like that, who have been involved in the series as a whole. And it's nice to highlight some of those who are involved in in this book. Like, that's a real coup, getting people like that who are obviously that passionate and that involved. So this is definitely like an insider's book. Gabriel, you've made me think also of the prequel now, like LA Takedown. You've taken me back to my youth and picking that up by accident at some car boot sale, and then being like, hang on a minute, this is quite a lot like Heat, and going from there.
It's like a rough sketch.
Right.
It's
really cool. I always like that movie, even though it isn't quite, it doesn't quite have the pizzazz as some of the as Heat and some of the other movies that came after it. And again, I think film noir has a really interesting place in Los Angeles film history as well. Some of those iconic movies from the 50s, I guess like Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard, and I guess some of those Mike Hammer, Mickey Spillane adaptations are obviously set there too. Some fantastic, Kiss Me Deadly and stuff like that. I always get a little bit mixed up which ones are where, but so if I'm getting anything wrong, you'll have to check on me. But yeah, like film noir in LA, that's definitely a connection for me. Okay, well, I wanted to just briefly ask you about the maps as well, because these books include these maps. Would one of you just like to pick up very briefly on the function of those maps, and are they intended for people to use, or are they more aesthetic? How do they operate?
Yeah, I mean, the maps, they're tricky in a way, because I mean, obviously technology is such now that anyone can crack open their phone, not crack it open, but literally use these devices, right? And you can access maps so easily. So specificity, if you want to find something, you find a location, you can do it pretty easily. You can pin things down. There's a real ability to be able to, you can have Google Street Map, so you can be there in place. And I think that was the difference between the last version of this book and this one, is that I wanted to add something. I think we all discussed this. I mean, it was something I was thinking about even before I came up with, the second volume, and was also thinking about it for anything that comes subsequently, is the ability to use a little bit of technology, not to kind of make it wholly dependent, because yes, this is probably, these are books that could exist just as easily online and could be a resource with locations and could be a lot more interactive. But I think the idea of keeping maps in there with the space that you've got available is to orient you a little bit, to keep reminding you of like what the city looks like, in terms of its periphery, and its location to the ocean. So because I think when you see a lot of Google Maps or anything, you're kind of a lot more directed in. You see a lot of streets and stuff around, which is great. And what we've done now is we've got these little QR codes. So you can, if you want, you can put the phone, you can set it up against every page. So once you've read the information, you've seen the screen grabs, you kind of get a sense of where it is on the map to other locations, which I think is actually quite useful, because you might be able to see what's nearby if you want to visit, if you happen to be nearby. But the thing is that we know is that not everyone has got access to LA, like they don't have access to all these other cities. So I think the availability of having something like Google Street View is brilliant, because you can go to it. And I think a lot of people, my kids now have the VR sets as well. And I remember during COVID, we did like a city tour of Valencia, which was interesting. I mean, I'm not a massive fan of that type of stuff, but I think the idea of being able to then locate yourself in those places, if you have that pinpoint, which I think the book is quite useful for. It's not the be all and end all. I don't think we're about technology and maps, but I think the addition of it, and I think the positioning yourself and seeing generally a visual plan of what the city looks like in the different regions is pretty useful. I mean, if you're going to use the particular maps to say, oh, I'm going to look for that, you ain't going to get the specifics of streets. But if you partner it up with a phone and you do the street map or the street view, and you're not in LA, you happen to be in Auckland, New Zealand, you can sort of get a sense, and it can get you close to the idea of what it's like to kind of do a 360, look around what's exactly there now, which I think is a nice little bonus. That accompanying Jared's photographs, which are brilliant, in the
Yes.
book, which I think add a massive, boon to the book, because in the past it's been a compendium. There's been different sorts of images taken by very different people. So I think the addition of Jared's professionalism as a photographer, as a professional photographer, as a collection, they're a great collection, because I think they are just as evocative in a way that you accompany those to the screen grabs historically or contemporary, because some of the films are a lot, closer to now than they were before. But that added to Google Street View, if you're using that, I think you get like a really nice, kind of, a sense of orientation in lots of different ways of these amazing locations.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And I would also just like to congratulate you, the three of you, on creating such a beautiful volume, because there was the previous volumes, they're hard acts to follow. Some of those books are stupendous, but it's interesting what you say, Gabriel. I totally agree. Jared's photography really unites the volume in a way that perhaps the others haven't had in the past, and there is this uniformity and this awesome quality to those images. So yeah, nice work, Jared. It's definitely
Thank you.
yeah. It's I kind of forgot for a minute that you had done all of the images, and I was leafing through the book before we jumped on this podcast today, and I was thinking, God, yeah, is it the paper? What's changed here? These images look stupendous. And just we got a little bit more a uniform.
There you go. You found the secret sauce, and it happened.
I think there are only 2 locations that I didn't photograph, and literally it's because there's nowhere to park. There was one location where I went multiple times, and it's in such a congested neighborhood with apartment buildings that there is literally nowhere to park, and I could never get out to take a photo. And the other location, place where there is nowhere, on a very busy road, and there's nowhere to pull over, so we had to resort to something else. But yes, just about all the images I shot, and I'm very proud of, and thank you guys for letting me do that.
Well, what a fitting tribute to Los Angeles, that the reason you couldn't get those remaining images because you couldn't.
It's true.
It seems
exactly right.
Fabrice, let me bring you in here, because I wanted to ask you, following on from what Gabriel has said, really. These days, there's all these apps, there's augmented reality, there's 1,000,001 ways to kind of do cine tourism. It's become really popular, and there's obviously a lot of digital tools. But for you, Fabrice, why is the book? Why is the book, so important, and why does this one work so well?
Old guy, see. I don't know. It's still the object, I mean, there's still the object around, and it's still. I mean, I guess a bit of. It's evolving, the relationship that we have to books anyway, or even the relationships I have to books. When I was in LA, I think when we moved back to France, I think my wife and I had like 2,000 books. What the hell are we going to do with all these books? And now, as the electronic book comes around, and you say, well, yeah, but you can't see it, so I get to do it bigger and so on. I mean, it's still this fetishism in a way about having the book there, especially something like this, because there's always this thing. I look back at some books sometimes, and I say, well, do I really want this 40-year-old paperback copy of thing that's getting all brown in the inside, and the pages are falling out and so on? Am I going to really see it again, or ever reread it? But books like this are constant things that you constantly go back to, because of. I mean, I have also the ones I've traveled through London and London, Paris, and Rome with the World Locations book and books, and particularly Rome, because Rome is such a rich place in terms of Italian neorealism. You say, oh yeah, this is where. So the scenes. And you say, well, where was this show? Oh, it's here, and so I think it's just a really great object still to have.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I certainly love to collect these books myself. Obviously being a book publisher, I've got quite a few books, but one has to get a little bit disciplined and strict with oneself. Otherwise, you'd end up having nothing but books in your home and no room to sleep or move about. But World Film Locations, I definitely have a few of those. And they certainly are wonderful objects, and they're a great collection. So I would definitely urge anyone who's checking out this podcast to visit www.internetbooks.com. Obviously, take a look for World Film Locations Los Angeles too. But if you go to our book series page, you can find the World Film Locations series, and you will find all of the books that have been published in the series. And it's such a wealth and depth. We have places you would expect, the Tokyos, the Romes, the Paris, the London, Los Angeles, New York, etc. But you have all these wonderful places like Reykjavik and Melbourne that pop up too, and it's almost like, oh well, what's this city's connection to cinema? And in some instances, like Toronto, perhaps it's because it's it's been a mimic for New York or other places. So there's always an interesting angle for each city. And so even if you think, well, hang on a minute, I don't know any films that were filmed there. Well, you'll find out a bunch, but also it's the angle, isn't it? And that the kind of the history of that location is such an interesting kind of reference to kind of discuss. Well, we haven't got much time left, so I wanted to ask you guys just a few quick time questions. So, off the top of the head, just let me know what your kind of answers are to these questions. So first of all, let's start with Jared, and I wanted to ask, other than LA, and the Valley especially, what are some of your favorite cinematic locations, cities or spaces? Are there other cities that you're like, wow, yeah, that's always an iconic location as far as I'm concerned?
Yeah, well, and we were talking about this with Gabriel before. I love Philadelphia because that's where I'm from, and I think when you really look at the films that have come out of Philadelphia, there are some common themes about underdogs and sort of people that are maybe are very talented or special, that are kind of going under the radar a little bit. And I think that's because it's sort of this position between New York and Washington, D.C., and it's often skipped over. Yeah. So I think there's some really great things that come out of there. That's probably my number one for various reasons, other than that's where I'm from.
Fabrice, what about yourself?
Because I live in Nice, so I'm right next to Italy, and my wife and I go to Italy quite a bit. Rome, I think, is a place, because it's again linked with the neorealism. Venice would also be another one in terms of what's been shot there. But Rome in general, because there's also a broad array of different things in Rome. While Venice is just so beautiful as Venice, and you treat Venice, but Rome has got more little alleyways and things, and a little more secret locations and things like that that you find. So I think of them as a cinematic city. It's a little further up on the list than Cleveland.
Yeah. And how about yourself, Gabriel?
I would definitely say Venice, just because it's such a weird concept of an entire city, especially that particular city teetering over a lagoon on a bunch of stilts. I mean, it's pretty freakish, but it's an amazing place. I've always loved visiting it. I think the World Film Locations kind of series sort of enabled me to visit some amazing places. And I really loved Marseille, because we did a book on that. And I loved New Orleans. But when we think about like locations that I've really, really loved, and that I've either stumbled across or something that was part of the project, is I really like the Popeye Village in Malta from Robert Altman's film, because it was basically preserved as this location that was kind of like a really cheap version of any sort of theme park. But it was really tired and run down, but there was something very evocative about it, just the fact that it did stay there, and very few people come to it. But I absolutely, I mean, I loved the film. I know a lot of people hated it, but I really rate it as something just quite surreal, in that surrealist vein. And I really loved St. Alphonsus Church in New Orleans from Angel Heart, because I got to visit that, and that was a brilliant, brilliant location. And then, Shakespeare and Company in Paris, just because I really like I love the, Before Sunrise, Before Sunset series. And it's just like one of these locations that I've been to a few times, but when the movie came out, it was like there was another reason that connected me to it, that was then like, here's like a really emotional connection that I have to it now because of the film and the characters and the story and everything else. And that's the beauty of the connections of locations to films, as they become hyper realized. They become something that becomes so evocative in our imaginary. And I think that's kind of the thing that linked us all together, as we spoke about the importance of, you know, that imaginary, and because we're very passionate about it as you know, film lovers, and some of us who are filmmakers, and then others that are, you know, like Jared, that writes about it and you know, does tours. But we also said that the importance of the series and the book, you know, as a standalone, but also the series as a whole, is that it's meant to enrich your sense of history and culture and identity, and how all of these things are connected to individual places, you know. And I know Jared does a lot of work in this area because he writes about locations, but he writes about them in connection with cultural identity, you know, or the history, or whatever it might be, you know, social anthropology, and all of those things, without making them really academic in the book. I think we cover them to a really good degree that doesn't put people off, but invites them into the conversation, invites them into the dialogue, invites them into the process of understanding how films can enrich that process, but also is like art imitating life, life imitating art, you know. And it's I just find it just, you know, unbelievably fascinating to me, and I'm just so I'm so appreciative of the fact that both of these guys got involved in this project, because like I said, it's just made it so much better for me. I've learned so much more about it.
Thanks, Gabriel. I appreciate you sharing that. It's another fascinating point. And again, it's nice to hear about this collaboration and the successes and the different ways you guys have brought different parts to the table. I do need a quick answer on this one. I'm just going to ask you guys very quickly a couple of questions that I think our listeners will be intrigued by. Jared, genre. Do you have a favorite genre?
Yeah, I'll probably go with horror.
Okay.
Probably go with horror. Yeah.
Nice. And Fabrice, what about yourself?
I think noir.
Okay. Yeah, contentious as well. Is it a genre or a style?
Well, yes.
Had that question raised a few times. Yeah, I agree with you. With you.
It's like light. It's particles and waves.
Yeah. And nicely put. And Gabriel, how about yourself?
Well, it's got to be on the back of Michael Mann's, you know, kind of heat. It's got to be like crime drama. You know, I think it's like everything that I love about films, and all the ones that are kind of top of my list are ones that cover the same sort of ground. You know, they're almost the same movie over and over again.
I'm going to throw in the Western into this mix as well, because I love the three genres that you have spoken about. And for me, the Western is so iconic because it's, you know, a truly American genre. And of course, you know, coming from Bristol in the southwest of England, spent a lot of time in New York, and now I live in Tucson, Arizona. So I'm right by Tombstone. And of course, one of my personal favorite movies, because of childhood memories, you know, is going to be Tombstone. So
good choice.
Yeah, I do this.
I think, James, you've just come up with a really good idea for a film, which would be a Western set in LA.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I love the way that
one that has been made already. So that's sort of a cross.
I'm just trying to think if it's been done. There's definitely. I mean, you could definitely say
like together. We have to get.
I mean, I guess there's probably many elements of the Western genre and these other genres that have been sort of you know, intertextually referenced by different filmmakers, you know, in LA. And I guess Tarantino, obviously, as everyone knows, is probably the main culprit of sort of bringing and mashing together different genres in different contexts, which I always find really, really interesting. There's definitely elements of you know, I guess like Hitchcockian suspense in like The Hateful Eight. So the last question for me today, before I let you guys head off for the weekend, a little tricky one maybe, but who would play you in your biopic? So it's the Jared Cohen biopic. Who you know, who's on the casting couch?
You know, It's very. I really have no idea. Maybe I'll just. I'm just gonna say somebody that I love. I don't think I have no connection to. I'll let you. I'm just gonna go with maybe. I'm just gonna throw out a young Gene Hackman, just because I love Gene Hackman.
Gene Hackman, nice.
That's
You know,
cool.
but because, and I'll be honest, like especially like newer actors, like I'm just not up on like maybe younger actors or something. So like I'll just go with a classic.
a young Gene Hackman. I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
Fabrice, how about yourself?
Well, I think Jim Jarmusch would.
Ah, yeah, I see that.
And then
I mean-
and then I think earlier on I could have played George Lucas
Yes, you could.
when he was young, you know.
Yes, you could. I mean, do you know?
And then but he's got a bit of a goiter now.
Well, of course, the book will be published in November, not long after Halloween. So maybe there's maybe rather than them playing you guys in the biopic, perhaps again for a launch strategy, we can all play one of these iconic actors as part of our Night's Drive collateral style around Los Angeles, throwing books out to the masses. So maybe that's a tactic that we can try in the internet marketing team. And without further ado, Gabriel, what about yourself?
Hi, Gabriel.
Well, when I was thinking about it, I was probably going down the same route of Jared, just thinking about people that I like. But the thing is, there's something I've always liked about Terrence Stamp, and I was thinking about a young Terrence Stamp. When I've seen him in movies, I just love it. I don't think he's anything like me, but the interesting story is that he did sit in my kitchen once because he was a friend of my stepdad, and when we moved to LA, I had no idea who he was. But he sat in our kitchen and then he left, and then I'd asked them, and they said Terrence Stamp. I was like, I don't know who this is. I was probably about 11 years old. And then not long after that, I went, I'd seen movies. And then I remembered, because the first movie I ever saw was Superman, the first Superman, with Terrence Stamp as General. I went back to it and I was like, holy shit. Sorry.
No, you good.
He was in my kitchen. So this was like 6 years after I'd seen the movie. So I was just like, oh man, I could have got him to sign my cape, my Superman cape that I had.
That's a cracker. That's a cracker. That's a cracker. On that note, I want to thank each of you for your time today. It's been wonderful having you on the podcast. Thank you for all your good humor and your insightful answers. I am so excited to see World Film Locations Los Angeles 2 gracing the shelves of many good bookshop, cinema, and various other retail outlets across the world from November. And just congratulations to you all. It's a fantastic volume, and I'm really glad to see the series is kind of picking up momentum again. Who knows where it will end up? But this volume is very much needed, and it's been great to see you three collaborate and come up with such a wonderful object book product. So thank you each for your contribution to the book and to this podcast today. So till next time, thank you.
Thank you for publishing.